Horror Story 1. This happened a long time ago, and thinking about it still scares me. I lived in Adair County, Kentucky, on a horse farm. One day, in the summer, about 5 years ago, my mother, who is the horse enthusiast in our family, found a horse she wanted to buy in Lawrenceburg. We'll call the seller of this horse James. For those who don't know, Lawrenceburg is one of several places in Kentucky where people claim to have seen the local version of Bigfoot, known as the hillbilly beast. It has been spotted in various parts of the state. My younger brother and I, being fans of this kind of thing, like most kids, went along with our mother hoping to see something interesting. Moving on, James's house was far from town, on a one-lane road, miles away from anywhere. Only a few houses were scattered here and there along the road, but one in particular, which I will never forget, caught my attention. We were about 5 minutes away from the house where we were going to pick up the horse, driving slowly because of the trailer attached to the back of our truck. As I looked out the window, hoping to see the hillbilly beast somewhere in the forest beside the road, I saw a peculiar house. This house had over 20 mannequins scattered in the yard, of all shapes and sizes. Most were lying down or leaning against what looked like a shed, but there were two that really frightened me. One was of an adult woman, tied to a tree by the roadside, so close that I could probably touch her if I rolled down the window and reached out. The second mannequin was baby-sized, nailed to a tree just a few meters away. Both looked very old and worn out, with signs of decay and mold. My mother stopped the car, and we all sat there, staring at the place. The house was old and dilapidated, clearly inhabited, while the shed next to it looked almost new, except for what appeared to be satanic graffiti written all over. Frightened, we decided to leave. Moving on again, when we arrived at James's house, we asked him about that strange place with the mannequin. He said he had never seen anything like it, and mentioned that he had been in town that morning and had driven exactly that road, so he probably would have noticed something. When we left James's house, we took a different route so that we didn't pass by the mannequin house again. Part of me believes it could have been a bizarre prank, but another part wonders, what if they weren't mannequins? Horror Story 2. Now, I am a 72-year-old man. This happened a long time ago, but I remember it so well. It was a series of events that led me to a mountain cabin outside Fred Circuit, Maryland, in 1969 or 1979. At that time, my life was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, and my father had passed away in a very painful manner, leaving me alienated. I needed to clear my mind, and the opportunity to move to an isolated cabin to live in peace and solitude was very welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I stayed there for 8 to 9 months, with no TV but with books and a radio. I had a library card and, if I remember correctly, no phone. The story begins a month after my arrival when a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in, although I never managed to train her to do anything. I fed her, and she was sweet, though not the smartest dog. A few months later, I began to sense a presence around the cabin. It's hard to describe, but it felt like someone was watching me. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking through the window of my cabin. The next phase was shadowing, or the act of being followed. I knew a few people who lived half a mile down the trail in the woods around, and sometimes I would visit them at night. Something or someone seemed to be waiting for me and following me closely in the forest, beside me, in the dark. You could easily hear footsteps in the woods, which quickened as I did. At night, this presence was there around the cabin. But here's the curious part. I never felt afraid, never felt threatened in any way, at least at first. There was no sense of malevolence. I spent a lot of time reflecting on the vast areas of forest around me. Frederick Municipal Forest extended for miles and miles. All of western Maryland was much more rural than it is today. None of the developments had been established yet. My dog and I came across signs of recent camping in the forest. Remnants of campfires and old abandoned buildings had corners that seemed to have served as shelters. They were filled with trash, leftover food, and drink. They might have been hunters, but many of these camps lacked the organization one would expect from experienced hunters. In the last month of my stay, That was when things began to intensify. Maybe he knew I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I started finding small dead animals at the base of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small porch with a screen door and 4 wooden steps leading down to the ground. A spotlight illuminated the long front garden, with the forest extending on both sides. The dead animals began to appear at the base of the steps on various mornings. I remember finding small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, and even a weasel, as if they were offering. I needed to collect them before my dog found and ate them. This happened almost daily for several weeks, but one night, very late, I was woken by some noises. Lying in bed, I heard something on the porch. I jumped up, turned on the lights, and saw my dog, one who had never learned to sit or stay still, standing at the front door in a perfect position, trembling with fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps going down the steps. I turned on the spotlight, saw nothing. I went outside and realized that someone or something had been on my porch, perhaps trying to get in. After that, I started noticing that the animal offerings got larger. Birds, a possum, a groundhog. It wasn't funny. The last 2 offerings were legs of some large animal, like a horse or a cow, bloody, one even skinned. On the second to last day, my dog disappeared. I heard her go into the forest, howling, following some trail. I tried to search for her in every possible way in the following weeks, but without success. She left the same way she had arrived. I returned to the Maryland suburbs, found an apartment with a friend, got a job, and moved on with my life. One day, not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with a monster from Sykesville. The article described a tall, hairy creature that walked on 2 legs, similar to a large monkey. It would choose a family or person to pay attention to. I wasn't the only one receiving this attention. The article described exactly what happened to me. Being followed at night, someone or something looking inside the house, leaving presents, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a large Bigfoot, I'd probably still be running, but I think I know what it was. Sykesville, Maryland, is the location of the Springfield Hospital, a large state psychiatric hospital, about 20 miles east of Frederick. At that time, many people knew how to live in the forest, people who grew up in the countryside. I think the monster was an escaped patient, or just someone with schizophrenia living off the radar, like the homeless you see in cities now. Maybe he was off his medication, but somehow managed and was lonely. He chose people or families to adopt. Those campsites in the forest could have been his. If he had nothing to do, played prank. I think he liked me but felt I was leaving. I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very typical of that time and place, and its behavior was noted in almost all cases. So I don't think it would have survived the deinstitutionalization of mental illness in the 1990s. When hospitals discharged mentally ill patients onto the streets, and hospital shelters were eliminated, leaving the mentally ill unprotected. Story number 3. About 9 or 10 years ago, I was living with my mom, dad, and older sister in an old house in a very small village. When I say small, I mean its only main feature was a small church and a few scattered houses, mostly inhabited by elderly people. At that time, it was summer, so I was on vacation from school or doing something else. Since we were so isolated in the middle of nowhere, I spent most of my time at home, glued to one screen or another. My usual routine was to wake up around 10 or 11 in the morning. By this time, my mom, dad, and sister had already gone to work, so I had the house to myself. I would go downstairs, make some toast, watch some random things on TV for an hour, before going back to my room to continue with whatever game I was playing. That was the habit of a 17-year-old boy isolated from the world by many fields. I should give a quick summary of our house. It was an old country house with 2 bedrooms upstairs, mine and my sister's, while everything else was on the ground floor. Upon climbing the stairs, you would reach a small landing, from where you could turn left to my room or immediately right to my sister's room. Basically, the layout was such that I could stay in my room with the door open and see directly into my sister's room, which was across from mine. I should also mention that the ceilings in both rooms were slanted. We were essentially in the attic, where the roof sloped downward, creating a crawl space that ran the entire length of the house on both sides of the rooms, each with a small access door. These spaces were mainly used to store normal attic things, Christmas decorations, or forgotten old toys. The doors to these spaces were small, thin, about 1 to 2 meters high, and had a small handle on the outside. This is important because by turning these small handles, it was possible to open the doors, but only from the outside. If the door was pushed to close with you inside, there was no way out. I found this out more than once. One door on my side ran along my room and another along a wall in my sister's room, while the door on her side ran along the other side, along my room. The space was not very large. You needed to crouch to walk, and most of the time spent in there was crawling on your knees. That morning, I was awakened by a familiar noise, something like a small creature moving in the crawl space on my sister's side. I could hear it since my bed was against the wall that ran along that space. It wasn't an unusual sound. Living in the countryside, we had rats almost constantly. They practically dominated the storage spaces, no matter how many traps we set. I didn't think much of it and got up to start my morning ritual of toast and TV. The first strange thing I noticed was that, while watching TV, I could hear movement upstairs. My mom's room was directly above the living room, so I assumed she simply hadn't gone to work that day for some reason. I continued eating and relaxing. 1 or 2 hours later, I went upstairs again and turned on my PC. While waiting for it to start up, I turned to the open door of my room and saw that my sister's room door was closed. I realized it was already late, and she still hadn't left her room, which was unusual since she normally parked on the living room sofa on her days off and didn't move until our parents came back. We weren't the most active family. I started thinking that maybe she was working and I had imagined the noise upstairs. But as I thought about it, I noticed the light gap at the bottom of her door and a shadow passed by. So there was definitely someone in there. It must have been her. Once again, I pushed the thought out of my mind and went back to my PC. Over time, the thought came back to me. Why would she be home and not leave? She only had a small TV in her room and no books. So what could she be doing there all day? I looked again at the shadow under the door, which was still moving. But what was happening? I finally decided to knock on her door. I knocked a few times and called her name, getting no response. Strange, I thought. Maybe she was wearing headphones or something. I knocked a little harder and called her name again, this time louder, with no response again. All right, I thought, I'll go in. I opened the door and looked around. I found the room empty, no one inside. A bit confused, but relieved that it seemed like it was just my imagination. I went in and looked more closely. That's when something filled me with panic. Near the back of the small door leading to the crawl space, there was a small hole that the rats had made to get in and out. It was very small, but big enough to fit half my hand through that hole and 4 fingers holding the door closed from the inside. At first, I thought it couldn't be fingers. It was impossible. But then I saw them slowly retreating through the hole into the crawl space. I was terrified. I left the room, closing the door behind me, and ran to my room. Being the reckless teenager I was, I grabbed the most imposing weapon I could find. Toy rifle I had brought from Disneyland a few years earlier. I thought that if whoever was hiding in the room didn't believe it was a real gun, maybe I could at least scare them with it. I ran downstairs to where my dogs were, on the other side of the house. I called my mom, who worked about 5 minutes away by car. She told me to stay put and that she and her boss were on their way. In the meantime, I replaced the plastic rifle with one of my dad's golf clubs. I felt much safer with that. Finally, my mom and her boss, John, arrived. I explained everything that had led up to this point, and they said it was okay. We all went upstairs to investigate. Not exactly heroically, I followed them with my golf club. We reached my sister's room, and I pointed to the door. I will never know if my mom is incredibly brave or ridiculously naive, but while John and I watched, she approached the door, opened it, and took a quick look inside. John and I were ready to pull her back from the clutches of a possible psychopath who might be there. Then, suddenly, she shouted, "Chris, what are you doing here?" Chris was my sister's boyfriend, a fact I was unaware of. The night before, My dad had asked Chris to leave since he had stayed for about 5 days. Chris accepted the decision, but instead of leaving, he and my sister devised a plan to make it seem like he had gone. He was hiding in the crawl space to spend the night and leave before my mom called him for work, staying there until everyone left in the morning. Only problem they hadn't anticipated was that I was home and conveniently sitting directly at the only exit all day. So he was trapped. When I knocked on the door, he hid behind it and kept it closed to avoid being discovered. My mom quickly sent Chris away and kicked him out of the house. Unfortunately, that was not the last time we saw the guy. When leaving, he stole some money from my sister's room and then started acting increasingly erratically. My sister, who made terrible decisions, ended up getting pregnant by Chris, who started breaking windows trying to reach her and the baby. A year later, for a time, we lived in the same city while I attended college, and he was in jail for stabbing someone in a completely different city. True example, the despicable individual. And as if that wasn't enough, remember that the only rooms upstairs were mine and my sister's. He had spent almost 14 hours there without access to a bathroom. But apparently, that wasn't a problem for him, as he accumulated an absurd amount of empty bottles that he kindly left for us to clean up. Finally, about a year later, my mom was getting the Christmas decorations stored at the back of the storage space when she made a horrifying discovery. She found a small bag full of feces. And worse, she found the bag right next to where my bed was, on the other side of the wall. The rustling that woke me up that terrible morning was in fact him hiding his feces among our utensils and the Christmas tree. The sense of horror upon realizing that he had left such a grotesque and invasive mark right next to my own resting space is almost indescribable. I feel a deep revulsion every time I think about how he was so close, hiding and watching without me knowing. It's a fear that never completely dissipates, knowing that he could have done so much more if he had been less cautious. Story number 4. I could tell you a million times about how, as a child and young adult, I felt scared or paranoid. Playing in the forest was fascinating. I spent my entire childhood exploring it, whether alone or with friends. Although we never went very far, we could always see the progression of our explorations as we grew older, due to the marks and sculptures we left behind. One time in particular was like 1,000 other times. My friend and I, fresh out of high school, were enjoying our last summer of freedom. We spent the entire summer camping and hiking through the forest. We decided to explore a new spot to set up camp, and after walking what seemed like a few miles, we found a lovely clearing. The area was relatively unknown to us, but we decided to set up camp, light a fire, and wait for nightfall. Our plan included smoking some marijuana and playing Monopoly. To give a bit of context, my friend is a bit eccentric, but comes from a family of foresters and has always had a deep knowledge of trees and plants. He wasn't afraid to camp alone. If I spent 10,000 hours in the forest, he probably spent 50,000 hours in the forest. As for me, I'm a taller and sturdier guy, and as I got older, I became more concerned with women and sports, and the forest became just a place for small parties. I never had the courage to camp alone. In fact, as I got older, I avoided going far alone because I could never shake the feeling of being watched. Although it was probably just paranoia, it wasn't a pleasant feeling. The camp was set up. The fire was burning, but starting to die down and needed more wood. The sun was setting, and both of us were busy cutting some extra branches we had collected to feed the fire. My friend was sitting in his small chair that he always carried and smoking from his makeshift pipe, while I was crouched, breaking some dry branches. Suddenly, a strong breeze blew. A powerful wind cut through the clearing. I couldn't tell if it was due to the speed of what happened or for another reason, but my friend and I stopped instantly and looked at each other. The breeze had passed just enough to reduce the fire to a small flame. We both stood completely still in the almost total darkness, not saying a word. On the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps that seemed to alternate between running and running back, coming from one side to the other in the same spot. Then, just as it had started, footsteps ceased with a softer sound in the underbrush. By the sound, it seemed like something was crouched. I was also crouched and knew I was observing something in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy?" And he did that, a wave of fear washed over me. I could feel and hear it in his voice. I was so focused on the footsteps and trying to understand what I was hearing that I didn't even think the fear was real. But it was a true and raw fear that made me feel powerless. I heard my friend, and after a while, he grabbed some leaves and threw them on the fire. The moment the leaves covered the fire, we plunged into total darkness. The fire quickly reignited, and then we got more leaves and branches and threw them on the fire. I added some twigs and logs, and neither of us looked away or moved for over an hour. Finally, the leaves slowly moved away from whatever was crouched and watching us, not moving for much longer than an animal normally would. Only when the footsteps disappeared did I realize that the smell had also vanished. The smell was like a paper factory burning eggs. We spent the rest of the night in whispers and observations, not moving or stopping to look at the spot. No one went to the tent, and I barely slept, lying on the ground with my head resting in my hands. My friend never managed to sleep. In the morning, we packed everything up and quietly went home. To this day, we talk about it, and in the 7 to 8 years since then, my forestry friend has never camped alone there. Story number 5. To start, I've always hated the city where I lived. I moved there alone at 18 for college and quickly regretted it. It was a reasonably sized city but full of unpleasant people. Almost all the gas stations were frequented by criminals, and there were shootings and robberies in broad daylight wherever you looked. For the first 3 years, I lived with roommates in a part of the city that wasn't terrible, but still not ideal. When I started making decent money, I decided to buy my own house. It was small, maybe 50 meters, super old, and poorly built. But since I lived alone, the size wasn't a problem. What attracted me to the house was that it was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and wooded areas, with only a few neighboring houses. Considering that I hated being in the city due to the constant fear of being robbed or shot, the idea of living out there was quite appealing. In early July, I moved in. Everything seemed very strange, and I couldn't get a good internet connection. A month passed, and the feeling of strangeness continued. I then decided to adopt a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place and spent long periods resting in the yard and trying to convince the neighbor to walk and pet him. About 2 months later, I started noticing things out of place. An important detail is that the former roommate used my guest room as storage until he moved out and still had a key to the house. He was never there, but he would show up once every 2 weeks to pick up something. Usually he would let me know beforehand, but I'd come home and find my kitchen chair pulled away from the table or a bowl in the sink. They were small things that I initially attributed to my former roommate passing through, or things I might have forgotten. Then, my dog developed severe separation anxiety. Previously, he didn't care when I left. He would just lie on the couch and chew on his toys. He never barked or did anything strange. But suddenly, he started acting really horribly. Every time I tried to leave, he would literally wedge himself through the door, desperate to stay with me. I would close the door and he would scream and bark, not stopping until I came back home. He didn't want me to leave him alone at all, and I couldn't buy him a kennel. So, one day, I decided to put on a movie, thinking that maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calm. I just needed to finish a work task and knew I'd be home early. So I put on a copy of Hamlet. I know it's a boring movie, but I chose it because the copy I had was about 5 hours long. Yes, I knew it would still be playing when I got back. I fast-forwarded 3 hours before Hamlet finished. When I walked in the door, I didn't know if the movie was playing, but the TV and Xbox were completely off. I immediately called my former roommate and asked if he had messed with it, and he wasn't even in town. I explained the TV situation to him and he shrugged, as if the TV turned off when idle for a while. Though this is true, there were several reasons why I knew that wasn't the case. First, it hadn't been idle for 5 hours. The movie should have been playing. Second, even if it had turned off, my Xbox had never done that before. I left it on for weeks when I was out of town, and it was still working when I came home. But this time, it was completely off. The strange part is that none of things were missing, and the door was locked. when I walked in, convinced me that there was something strange with the Xbox or whatever, and I shrugged it off until my dog started acting even stranger. Remember, I mentioned he used to get along well with the neighbor. Suddenly, when she walked by the house while he was outside, he would start barking and running to me, away from her. This was incredibly strange to me and made me extremely wary of her. I installed some cheap alarms on my doors, which make a sound when the door is opened, and slept with my gun at hand. On the second night, the alarms were on my doors. I was woken up by one of them at the back door and ran out of bed with my gun, trying to convince myself I was about to face an intruder. But when I reached the door, it was closed and no one was there. The alarm had been knocked all over the room. The door would have to be open for the alarm to fall like that, so it couldn't have fallen and landed there any other way. Strangely, the door was locked, but not the way I had locked. I always locked the doorknob, but when checking my lock afterward, only the doorknob was locked. Police couldn't do much since there were no witnesses or clues, so they didn't have much to investigate. Needless to say, I changed the locks and had no noticeable problems afterward. Later, I found out that the nearby neighbor my dog hated had previously lived in the house I was renting, and the locks had never been changed. I can't prove my theory, but it's quite obvious that she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. Although I can't figure out anything, my dog has since disappeared. The most unsettling thing for me, however, is that she tried to enter at night until the alarm scared me. How many times could she have been in my house while I was sleeping? And why? Thank you for watching another episode. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing more videos like this to you. See you next time.